Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Writing with Subtext. Today, I want to jump right in and talk about players and how you can use Muse to quickly generate the players that populate your story. Right here, I have a story that I created a while back called Bait and Switch. It was a psychological thriller, and it takes two brothers, Max and Leo, who have a strange relationship. They embark on their annual fishing trip in the wilderness. And as they journey deeper into the unknown, they start to encounter a series of strange and unsettling events. Their fishing gear is mysteriously sabotaged. They find bizarre symbols carved into the trees, and they hear eerie whispers in the wind. It becomes a psychological battleground, and then Rupert Quill, a character from their past, emerges as the catalyst for the brothers' confrontation from their past. He is the physical entity in the wilderness that the brothers must confront, forcing Max to face his guilt and the dark secret that has strained his relationship with Leo. So that is the complete story, the blending of the 4 through lines. And I have other videos that go over how you would take your basic story idea. That was what I had started out with here, how you can take that and extract out the 4 through lines and then blend them together to get a blended idea of how all those through lines work together to create your complete story. So the next step would be to look at the players of your story. And what Subtxt does is it automatically adds in and attaches the 2 most important players to your objective story, and that would be the main character and the obstacle character. So Max, the businessman from the city, he's the main character. He's also a part of the objective story, and his motivation here is aware. That's his pivotal element in the story. So if I go to the story form here and we look at the pivotal elements, we'll see the main character pivotal element is aware, and then the obstacle character's pivotal element will be self-aware. So that's the argument that the 2 of them have against each other, that you and I are both alike. So automatically, you get these 2 players right up front. And if you do nothing else, this is the most important thing, is that the main character will have one of these elements and the obstacle character will have the other. And the nice thing about that is it ties character into plot. So it's not just this random thing that happens out of nowhere, which you'll see as we go through and use Muse to create random illustrations of characters. They're actually going to be attached to parts of structure that will make them random yet meaningful, and they'll be attached to the order of the story in which we are creating. So in this story, the goal is conceptualizing. I don't believe I have the goal actually figured out in here. Being entangled in a dangerous scheme is just the random idea that came up out of this. So I think what I'll do, just for the sake of getting this done really quick, I just hit develop for the story goal. And I just want to tell it, I want the goal of this story to be about figuring out possibly finding a way out of the dangerous scheme. I have no idea how the story starts, but I do know because of the story form that I picked, the goal of it's going to be conceptualizing, trying to put all the different pieces together and envisioning a way out of it. And that sounds like a compelling story goal. In the context, this could mean that the characters need to understand the intricacies of the dangerous scheme they're entangled in and to devise a plan to escape this. To develop this further, consider the following. And this is exactly what I would have said. Identify the protagonist and antagonist. Who is driving the pursuit of the goal? That's the protagonist. Who is trying to prevent it? That's the antagonist. There is nothing in here about main character or obstacle character. You just have protagonist and antagonist. And the main character could be the protagonist, or the main character could be the antagonist. Define the dangerous scheme, which is what I thought this was going to do. What is the nature of this scheme? How does it pose a threat to the characters? Develop the process of conceptualizing and show the struggle. All this stuff is fantastic, but way beyond the scope of this video. So let's just do 2. Can you just come up with a random idea or number 2 just to illustrate the goal? And then we'll move on to some of these other steps. It should just come up with a quick illustration The dangerous scheme could be a plot orchestrated by a powerful corporation to exploit a remote wilderness area for its resources. Unbeknownst to the brothers, their annual fishing trip takes them right into the heart of this operation. Oh, okay. So this is like the behind the scenes sort of thing that's going on, but also because the corporation is willing to go to great lengths to keep it secret. All right. That's okay. Do I like that? It's all right. Evil corporation. Is there any way we could do something other than an evil corporation? I like basic idea that there is something going on in the background, but I feel like I've seen that one before. Just to kind of push it a little bit further and see if we can get something that is reasonably exciting for what is supposed to be a short and informative video. The dangerous scheme could be a covert operation by a group of treasure hunters who believe a legendary artifact is hidden in the wilderness. Oh boy, that one is okay too. I mean, yeah, that one, that's great. How about one more that's not like any of those other and is more aligned with the supernatural thriller aspect of the story? Maybe just to key that in there to give it more of the supernatural part and less of the thriller part. Because the corporation was definitely thriller, hunters, thriller. Okay, let's just go with this one. The dangerous scheme could be a centuries old curse that has been awakened in the wilderness. The brothers, during their fishing trip, unknowingly trigger an ancient ritual site, awakening a vengeful spirit that begins to wreak havoc in the wilderness. All right, we'll go with that for right now. In a different world, and if I was really working on the goal, I might try and work on something a little more detailed, but that's fine for right now. Now, if you remember at the beginning of that conversation, it asked, identify the protagonist and antagonist. So who is the one pursuing the resolution of that? They've awakened this curse, they're entangled in it. Who is the one that's going to be driving to get themselves out of it? Now, just for the sake of something interesting, the traditional thing would just be to attach Max, the main character, as the protagonist, right? Just make him the protagonist. He's the one trying to figure a way out, put all the pieces together. And that probably commercially is probably the best way to take it. But just for something fun, I'm actually going to make him the antagonist. So let's go into here. And at the end of it, I'll say that's a great idea. Let's go with that. Now let's make Max the antagonist. And so what I'm doing is I'm just having a conversation with Muse and collaborating with the intelligence that's there to help bring order to these random story ideas to kind of give it some meaning. Making Max the antagonist adds an interesting twist. It certainly does. Max would be the character who's trying to prevent the story goal from being achieved. And we would have to come up with a reasonable reason why that is, some psychological reason why he likes being caught up in the curse. Maybe he prefers to have that than the nonsense in the business world. He could be skeptical about the existence of the curse and dismissive of the strange occurrences. He might believe there's a logical explanation. That is making him a little bit more likable. Here's how it could play out. Max denies the existence of, and then it just went through and talked about the different stages of how it would go through the story. But we have the story form. We don't necessarily need this in there. If you're not familiar with the antagonist or protagonist of a story and how that relates to the story form, is what are those elements that are driving an antagonist? That sounds great. What are the elements that drive antagonist again? So for all the archetypal characters, there are two primary elements that define that player as an antagonist in the story. And if you can't remember this, again, you can always just reach out and ask Muse. And so the two elements are avoid and reconsider. So avoid is somebody who's trying to avoid resolution of the goal or trying to prevent it. And reconsider is always trying to get people to rethink it. Like, hey, maybe we should do this. A typical antagonist. So those are great. Avoid and reconsider. And so what I would do manually speaking, because Muse is in a process of being able to, once we come up with these elements, then it will keep track of that in its memory. It doesn't quite have that set up. You have to do it manually, which really isn't the worst thing in the world, especially if you're learning this stuff. So I just added a void, and then I would add reconsider, and then bait. Now he's the antagonist. And the more elements we have for every player, the more meaningful or more important that player is to the story. So this is fine for Max. Not only does he have that pivotal element of awareness, which will tie into what the story is all about. The story is about, despite how bleak things can get, you can outdo a group through careful planning by staying hyper aware. Okay, so he's always going to be hyper aware of everything. But it's interesting because this is a success story. So this might change a little bit. Well, let's see who the protagonist is. Now, typically speaking, when the main character is not the protagonist, then the obstacle character ends up being the protagonist. And that's usually the way that it goes. So I'm totally fine with Rupert being the protagonist, but maybe let's do this. Let's make this a little more complex. So you have your black and white answers. Like the black and white answer is Max is both protagonist and main character. Rupert Quill is both obstacle character and antagonist. That would be your typical story. You can kind of mix it up, do something a little bit different. So what I'll do is I'll add a new player, and this will be Leo, right? His brother. And he is going to, because he doesn't have any elements, he's really not attached to the story. He's just an empty vessel, which is why if I were to start working out the story, I would have no idea what Leo is doing in the narrative. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make him the protagonist. So again, down here, we'll say that sounds great. Just a means to confirm it so it knows it later that that is in memory. And then I would like to make Leo, that's his brother, the protagonist. What are the elements that drive that archetypal character? And they will be the two elements that are opposite of avoid and reconsider. So in the same way the main character and the obstacle character are at odds, the protagonist and antagonist are at odds in terms of the plot. So here we have pursuit, which is the opposite of avoid, and then consider, which is the opposite of reconsider. Reconsider is somebody who's always like, hey, let's look at this again. Let's look at this again. Should we really be doing this? Whereas consider is like, I think this is a good idea. Or what's the right thing to do? What's the wrong thing to do? And now I got a little bit more interest and a little bit better understanding of who Leo is. So I can add pursuit and I can add consider. And now they have these two motivations that give me an idea of who Leo is besides just being the small town brother that's on a fishing trip with his other brother. He's the one that's going to be trying to unravel it and put everything into place, like trying to unravel the scheme, while Max maybe is caught up in what's really going on and making more out of it and really doesn't want it to end because the adventure is so exciting. And possibly because putting all the pieces together will unravel that past. So he's his own kind of worst enemy, trying to make sure things don't happen. And what you have here, you have aware, avoid, reconsider to see how that plays out in the story. You can just randomly pick an illustration here. Max avoids telling people he has lupus. Well, I actually think, don't I have some great illustrations here? Okay, great. For this, I already have an illustration here for each element. So Max's avoid element could be his denial. All right, that's kind of cool. Put that in there. And then I will take the one that came up with for reconsider, which will be right here. Max's reconsider. Pop that one in there. And then let's just do a random one for, he's hyper aware. So let's see, I would say Max is overly responsive and hyper aware to everything going on around him. Max is heavy into psychedelics. Like he's one of these highfalutin corporate executives that's really into psychedelics, and that's made them more really aware of everything that's going on and is therefore highly tuned to everything that happens around him. So I have these three very specific elements. And in the same way that you can blend the four through lines together, we can blend these three together into an idea of what Max will look like in terms of the story goal, because all of these elements are in relationship to the story goal. So I'll just do this. I'm just going to quickly put together these three. And now we have a great encapsulation of how Max would appear in the story, and it made him way more interesting, I think, than if he had been the protagonist. And again, this is how you generate interest. I'm just making stuff up on the fly, trying to look for the most interesting version of these different characters just by throwing out different layers of structure, different ideas of story form against these characters. And if it doesn't work and I just go back to the regular protagonist antagonist thing, that's fine. But I'm just trying to show how you can do something a little bit different. So then for Leo, we'll just do the same thing. Grab those explanations here. I'll put one here, and I believe I can just put this one here and then there. Again, blend those two together. What drives this player towards or away from the story goal? So he's going to be moving towards the goal. In his role as the determined and resourceful brother becomes the driving force. So he's the one that's going to want to figure out how it all puts together. And they're going to be at odds, not only emotionally in the relationship story through line, it's about their friendship, their sibling relationship. That's a very heavy emotional stuff, but more practically speaking, they're going to be at odds with one another because Max is the antagonist and then Leo is the protagonist. So then that leaves Rupert. Now there's a couple different ways you can do this. You can say suggest, and it will suggest some remaining elements. You don't want to repeat. You don't want to have 5 protagonists. Maybe he is temptation, maybe he's hinder. If you don't know what all these elements mean, you could just reach out and say, okay, I'm trying to figure out which of the archetypal characters Rupert Will would be, since Max is the protagonist and Leo is the antagonist. What are my other choices? And it should go through and list out the remaining 6 archetypal characters. So in a complete story, you have 8 archetypal characters. They're like perfect characters, and perfect meaning they're the perfect alignment of their motivations. It's doing a fantastic job of listing out the remaining, well, it's got 4 of them. There should be 2 others. The Guardian, which is your mentor wizard thing, represents positive values and provides aid to the protagonist. If Rupert kills the Guardian, he could provide crucial knowledge or assistance to Max in understanding breaking the curse. That would be the easy. That's what I would probably guess that he would be, the role that he would play in the objective story. Now, the thing that's opposite to the Guardian is the Contagonist. It acts as a tempter and a distractor, creating obstacles that slow down the protagonist. Oh, remember, see, it's doing this thing where it's automatically assuming Max is the protagonist. So this help and conscience is in relation to Leo, right? The temper and distractor, that could also be in relation to Max because it's really to everybody, but it's just something to keep in mind. If Rupert Quill is the contagonist, he could introduce doubts or alternative theories. I actually really like that. He could just be a sidekick, which is he's there just to cheer them on. He's a skeptic. He could be really negative about stuff. The 2 that are missing are the 2 most boring ones, I think, which are reason and emotion. So the person that's most logically driven and the person that's most feeling driven. I would like Quill to be the contagonist. So let's make Quill the contagonist. What would be his 2 driving elements? Because says Max is the antagonist, Leo is the protagonist. I'm going to assign Quill to be the contagonist. So he's going to appear to be the bad guy when really it's all about Max is the problem. And the contagonist is driven by these 2 elements. Hinder as opposed to avoid, where Max is specifically trying to prevent any kind of resolution, whether he knows it or not. The hinder elements is just kind of getting in the way. It's just like a roadblock, like an obstacle. And then temptation is trying to take the easy way out, not thinking of the consequences. And that's great. And if I was wanting him to be the straight antagonist, I would probably do that. But what I'd like to do is take the opposite. Like, I really like hinder, but I really would rather have, instead of having trying to motivate these guys to take the easy way out, because this is his attempts to convince Max to abandon his quest, perhaps by offering a seemingly simpler solution. I want to make him the opposite of that, which is conscience. And the reason why I know that's the opposite is because the Guardian character, well, if Will was the Guardian, what would be those two elements? And it'll be the opposite of these two. So in the same way that the protagonist was the opposite of the antagonist on those two elements, the Guardian is the opposite to the contagonist. So hinder, the opposite will be help. And then the opposite for temptation will be conscience. So there you go, help and conscience. And so if I wanted him to be the straight mentor, guardian, he's there to help everybody. And if this was like an hour TV show or something really simple, I might just make him straight up the guardian. But let's mix and match. And you can start to see how you could break out of these archetypal characters. Okay, so I really like hinder from the antagonist example, but I also really like conscience from the guardian example. Can we make will driven by those two elements? What would that look like? So I've made him more complex and more interesting because it's natural that help and conscience go together. It's natural that hinder and temptation go together. It's natural that avoid and reconsider go together. That's why they're archetypes. So if Rupert Quill is driven by both hinder and conscience, it could make him a unique blend of contagonist and guardian. So for hinder, Quill could create obstacles or complications that slow down, I would say, the boy's progress. This could be due to Quill's own doubts, fears, or his protective instincts towards the boys. For example, he might sabotage their journey because he believes it's too dangerous. And then despite his hindering actions, Quill could also be the voice of moral reason in the story. He might be the one to remind the boys of their importance of facing their guilt and seeking redemption. His conscience-driven actions could stem from a deep sense of responsibility or guilt. And the reason why I change it from the boys is because it's specifically moving it towards Max, just because it's blending the main character and protagonist into the same character. So I love those ideas. I will just take hinder and I will put it in, hinder. And then what? Temptation. So let's put hinder here. And then let's put the definition it had for temptation. Oh, it's conscience. That's funny. So let's do this. We can always remove it by just tapping it, getting rid of it, and then let's make it conscience. Put that in there. And then I would say, I got to do self-aware. So whereas, and this is the pivotal elements of the story, whereas Max is super aware, Quill is very self-aware. So let's see what that. Rupert Quill is conscious of a group's existence. Rupert Quill is aware of oneself. Self-aware, that's not very helpful. Thinks so little of oneself. Okay, I like that. Let's do that. It's an interesting character. So I just kind of rifled through different illustrations of that until I found one that kind of connected with me due to his own doubts, fears, or protective instincts. So that's why he kind of thinks so little of himself. So right there, we have those three characters. And if this was a short story or maybe just something really small, I could just keep it to these three and I wouldn't need the other characters. If I wanted to, though, and I just wanted to populate out the rest, I would say, okay, great. I've got three players set up now. Max is the antagonist. Leo is the protagonist. Rupert Quill is the hinder conscience player. Now, please come up with 6 more players. The first one will be the opposite to Quill, and his motivating elements will be help and temptation. So I don't know who that's going to be. Maybe a local sheriff. And then for the remaining, which would be sidekick, skeptic, reason, and emotion, please come up with sketches of these characters in relation to the story goal. Because these are always in relation to the story goal. That's why we did that first. It should pick up on those remaining 4, pick out their motivating elements, look at them in context of the story goal, look at them in context of what the other characters have already been assigned to, and then give us our cast. Here we go. Sheriff Ada Boone, driven by hope and temptation. So she's kind of another mix of a guardian and antagonist. We've got the sidekick, Sam Squint McGinty. He's a local wilderness guide and a friend of the brothers. All right, that's a nice sidekick. And you can see these are lesser characters. That's why the protagonist and antagonist are the most important, and then whoever has the other pivotal element. And then these others just kind of round it out. Dr. Eleanor Ellie Hargrove is a rational and skeptical archaeologist who initially dismisses the brothers' claims about the curse. Great. She could die by the midpoint. Professor Marty Kellerman is a historian and old friend of Max and Leo's father. As the voice of reason, he provides logical advice and level-headed solutions. Great. Michael Caine could be the voice of reason. And then emotion. Lily Chambers is a local journalist who becomes emotionally invested in the brothers' story. Perfect. And then, it did another opposite to Quill. Oh, that's funny. It went ahead and did this character, but then it also came up with another one. Father O'Malley is a local priest who offers spiritual guidance and assistance to the brothers. However, his temptation element could manifest as him trying to convince the brothers to abandon their quest and leave the curse in God's hands. That's actually a really interesting character. And you could see how O'Malley would work as such a great counter to Quill, the opposite to Quill, because he would be wanting to help, but he's coming from a place of taking the easier way out, which is also interesting because you would usually associate conscience with a priest. Culturally, that's the preference, the default. I love all those characters. What I would do then is just add them in here in the objective story players for Subtxt so that you can use it later. Or I could just go ahead and start writing my story with these characters as maybe explore why they are driven to be this way. That would be where you get into backstory kind of thing. These motivations are strictly their position in relation to the story goal. If a player doesn't have any of these elements, they're pointless. You can take them out of the story. Nobody will miss them. If you want a character to be part of the story and to have some investment into what's going on, they need to have these elements that motivate them in relation to that story goal, with some of them being for it, like Leo trying to figure out this crazy, entangled, dangerous scheme, and then some of them against it, like Max, who will be, for whatever reason, is trying to prevent it and bring it all down. So that's it for this episode of Writing with Subtxt. I wanted it to be 10 minutes and went another 30. It's really hard just to do these things really quick. For those of you who stayed around, if you have any questions about any of this, please leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, I will see you next time.